pose something to everybody. We think about data viz in general, but especially accessibility in the wrong way. And it's purely because of human nature. We build things that work and appeal for us first, and then only later do we consider our users. And that's perfectly human. We work based off of our experiences. But that doesn't work for some users because they work differently than us. They may have loss of fine motor skills, so they can't use a mouse. They may not be able to see colors. So in our little drawing here, which I love, that's from Kendra Little from the SQL community, this user is really sad because this Power BI developer made her a all different shades of green pie chart with a red background and cursive font, and she can't get the information she needs out of it. And that's kind of where we all start, and that's okay. You got to start somewhere, but we can build upon that and be aware of things that we can do, and in a lot of cases, just small changes to make things very accessible for other people. So before I open up Power BI Desktop, there's a way of approaching it. And if you can kind of change your mindset and approach data viz like this, then it helps you to make a more accessible report. So most of us have grown up thinking of disability as a medical condition. Someone is in a wheelchair that needs to be treated by a doctor, or someone has had vision loss. That is a thing that needs to be operated on, or therapy must be done. The disability is the fact that they have a condition that is different than most people. There's another way of looking at this called the social model. And this is that the disability in and of or the condition in and of itself is not the disability. It's the societal barriers that are actually creating the disability. So think someone in a wheelchair can't go travel down the street because it doesn't have wheelchair ramps on the curbs. They would have to hop up and hop over the curb, which for a lot of people is not possible. Or restaurants that have stairs up to an area and no elevator. Same thing, but apply this to technology, to web pages, and then to data visualization in Power BI. So if you have that in mind, we can approach data viz design in general with a universal design mindset. And what that really means is that we're going to make one design, and we're going to make it such that it accommodates the largest number of people in our intended audience. So that could be, people who can't use a mouse, so that things are keyboard accessible. That could be color blindness or low vision. But instead of making special features for them as we design our reports, we're going to build for everybody and have a set of base functionality that everyone can use. So in the end, when we do this, it's going to benefit more than just disabled users. It's actually going to make our reports more usable in general. But we're going to do it with the understanding that we can't accommodate 100% of people. There will always be someone that has trouble. It takes, too long. Sometimes the features aren't there to catch every single person. But that shouldn't make us say, oh, well, we're just not going to accommodate anybody but ourselves. There are better answers and ways to start on this. So that takes us to two terms that if you've been a developer for a while, you might recognize from the 90s, graceful degradation versus progressive enhancement. So graceful degradation, it was used, at least I became aware of it, when we were talking about the change to modern browsers. So in graceful degradation, people would just build for the most advanced browser, or user in our case for accessibility, knowing that other people would have a downgraded experience. Progressive enhancement still acknowledges that people have different experiences, but we identify a baseline of what people should be able to do, and then we add extra functionality. So we're not saying don't use all of those advanced features that we have in Power BI, but we are saying make sure that the main points of your report, the main way you would like people to engage and the information they should get out of it is there for everybody, and then add on. So this is why this makes it better for all users, not just people with certain disabilities. Accessibility is really a subset of usability. So usability, I'm defining as effectiveness and efficiency, or basically the satisfaction with which users can do what they're trying to do in your report. Accessibility is how well people with disabilities can do that. So if you've never checked it out, there are some really neat accessibility features built into Power BI, both in desktop and in PowerBI.com. If we, oops, go to the right browser window somewhere.
Scott was getting a shout out for Kendra as well. So Scott Stauffer from Vancouver's on the call and said, "Yay for Kendra." So anyways, I just thought you'd
Yes,
want to know that.
she is awesome.
Yes, she is.
So I'm in this report, and we'll walk through this report little by little over the course of the hour, but just to show off some accessibility features, there are keyboard shortcuts built in, and they're the same in desktop as they are in the web, but I can navigate the visuals in my report and the pages within my report without using a mouse. So we can see the menu here. I can then close that, and I'll show off some of the things that we can do. So I access that menu by typing a question mark. And you can see that we can go to different visuals, go to different pages, and even access some of the menus in there. So I'm just going to cheat and select this visual because I am not very adept at navigating with a keyboard instead of a mouse. And then I can tab through all the other visuals. So I'm just going to stop on this highest growth occupations by percent change. And you can see the little menu at the top with our pinned to dashboard and other visual menu options. And then I can hit, see if I remember these, Alt-Shift F10 and open up that menu. So maybe because I have a challenge with cognitive abilities, I want to focus on one chart. So I can choose Spotlight and then just read this chart without anything else creating any kind of distraction for me. And then I can hit Escape and get back out of it. I could also do Alt-Shift F11. Oh, if I have my visual selected, Alt-Shift F11, and it'll take me to an accessible show data page. So we already have the show data option in the menu, but this one's slightly different. We get the chart at the top, and then we get this table at the bottom that shows everything that's in the chart as well as any tooltips. But when I go to the normal one, normal being the show data option for the menu, you'll notice our table looks just a little different. That's because the first one I showed you is accessible for screen readers. They've designed it such that it makes it really easy to read from a screen reader. Screen readers have special functionality where it can read only certain rows or just headings or just read the whole thing so that people can get an idea of the individual values that we're trying to show if they can't actually just see the visual very well. And then if I go back, I can hit Control F6, maybe, there we go, and change pages. That's another page. And then I'm working within the visual, and then I can go back and change it to another page. So that's all of our keyboard navigation. And there's one more thing that doesn't have to do with keyboard accessibility that just came out this month. It's this high contrast colors option under View. So if I choose high contrast colors,
oh, that's nice. I like that.
It can make it much easier for people with different vision and cognitive challenges to read this. So there's 4 options right now, and this should also work in desktop. That one's my least favorite. So I'm going to change it back, but know that that's available for people. So if the colors are not useful or a distraction or not working for someone, you can have them try that inside of PowerBI.com. So One reason a lot of people start looking into accessibility is because they need to be compliant. And if anyone knows why there's a poodle on the page, 10 points for you. Um, Compliance in this area is largely centered on WCAG compliance. There are others out there, but it's mostly the largest, most widely adopted. So WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And yes, it's really about web pages, but technically powerbi.com is a web page. So the way that it works is that it has principles with guidelines underneath them, and then success criteria and sufficient techniques, meaning here's what you have to do to meet some level of accessibility. And they rate them A, AA, AAA. So the newest version is coming out this month. I don't think it's out yet. And here's an example of the guidelines. So guideline 1.4 is that things must be distinguishable. And the sufficient technique, level A, for the use of color is that color can't be used as the only visual means of conveying information or distinguishing a visual element. This applies to Power BI perfectly. We love KPIs. We love to make KPIs by changing things from red to green in color to indicate bad or good. Well, red and green are actually the two hardest colors for people to distinguish when they have color vision deficiency. So there are sufficient techniques, meaning, hey, use an icon or text instead, or in addition to whatever you're doing as far as just using color. So here's a couple others that we'll just take a look at that I think are particularly relevant. Text should have a contrast of at least 4.5 to 1. And I'll show you how to measure that. It's actually really easy, and I like that it has numbers. It's not subjective. That just means you need to make it readable for people with low vision or color vision deficiency. Accessibility is hard, but some of this is very, very practical, and we can understand it even if we can't relate to not being able to see that way. Another one is that all functionality should be operable through a keyboard. Keyboard accessibility, people who can't use a mouse, people who use screen readers, that type of thing. That's it. So if you work in US government, you might be aware of 508 compliance. If somebody else knows about European and other places, what they use for this, please put it in the chat and we'll all learn. 508 compliance is from the Rehabilitation Act. And what most people don't understand is it applies for both members of the public, so anything created for the public through the government, as well as federal employees, when it's developed, procured, maintained, or used by federal agencies. Meaning if you got funding from the federal government to do a Power BI report, you could be subject to having to comply with Section 508. Now, the good news is 508 compliance is now aligned with WCAG standards. So you can go research WCAG standards, and you're also learning about 508 compliance. That used to not be the case, but it is now. There's a little clause in 508 that says if compliance imposes an undue burden, you can provide an alternative means of access. So yeah, you can go out and make your Excel document version of it that just has data that's easy to read, because Excel is actually pretty accessible. But now you're maintaining two versions. Do you want to guess how long it's going to take for that second version to get out of date and to never make it back to be equivalent to your Power BI report? We're all busy. We understand that things like that are going to happen, but now you're technically out of compliance again, and you're showing probably old data. So if we know that we need to be accessible either because of legislation or just goals to be more inclusive, we can think of accessibility as having 4 categories. So we'll go through these categories and look at examples in Power BI, actually of things that I've done wrong in the past. I'll show you what not to do and then some quick changes to make it more accessible. So we'll start off with hearing. We don't think of audio a lot in Power BI reports, but it does happen. It's been used in some really great and really awful ways. People with hearing issues may be really sensitive to sound. or they may not be able to hear at all. So there's a full spectrum. But what we want to remember if we use audio in Power BI is that we don't want our audio to autoplay. Have you ever gone to a news website and then some video starts playing, but it's like down in a corner and you can't find it and you have to scroll and now you're angrily trying to find it, shut it off. And yeah, I know there are browser add-ins to make that stop, but in general, that stresses us out or at least annoys us. Same thing, but in a, let's say, a work setting or in a, trying to provide information setting to the public, that's not a good practice. So we don't want things to autoplay. And then for people who can't hear the audio, we want to either caption our videos or have a transcript of our video or audio. And that may sound tough, but there are lots of free shortcuts out there. So we can take Google Docs and do voice transcriptions to get us started. It won't be 100% accurate, but sometimes it's faster than having to type it all out. It'll give you, say, 70% there, and then you go back and fix the issues and omissions. YouTube, when we upload videos to YouTube or when we do live streaming, it auto captions things for you for free. But again, it won't be 100% accurate, but they do let you go back and fix it. So it's a great way to do the real-time captioning. There are tons of paid services that are really good, but if you're just starting out and it's hard to make a case to your organization that they should spend money on this, there are some easy ways to make free transcriptions. So I did this on a blog post that I wrote for my company, Blue Granite, when we were showing what it's like to use Power BI with a screen reader. We recorded the whole screencast video, and then I went back and basically just typed up a Word doc that describes everything that's going on in the video because I was talking to an audience that might need that. So I'll show you an example where audio was used in Power BI. Actually, one second.
It was there for a second.
Yep. Okay, now it's coming back. So a while back, I think end of last year, there was a bookmarks contest, just show creative use of bookmarks. So this was my report, and it was made somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I was just having fun. And it was just random facts about people. People are weird and interesting and resilient. So first I started out with percent of US population by phobia, according to this source listed here, and phobia symptoms. So people have weird fears. And then kept thinking I could never live without you by my side. There's an actual health condition called broken heart syndrome. It's also called apical ballooning syndrome, but it happens usually to older women and it mimics symptoms of a heart attack, but it is not a heart attack. And so it gets misdiagnosed. And so it's something people should be aware of. But then I spent so many nights just thinking how you did me wrong. I found a data source for infidelity by the numbers. You can look up what's going on in people's relationships according to that source. And I also use bookmarks here for I Grew Strong and I Learned How to Get Along, where I can switch out my charts, change the visibility. So if you heard that, that's kind of surprising and jarring to people. We don't want surprise sound in our reports. As fun as that was to make, I knew it was going to be annoying. It was kind of purposefully annoying because I was just playing around. But I've seen people use legitimate sound. People have put links to podcasts or little audio players that are custom visuals to a podcast that's relevant to their topic. People have embedded videos. I had a client that made a help video that they put inside of their dashboard to help people understand how to use Power BI when they were first introducing it to the organization. They're great, but either people who couldn't hear couldn't take advantage of the video because it wasn't captioned, or if they did not set it to autoplay, they were much better than me. That's a issue there that it's going to autoplay. Maybe it's annoying to you, but think of also the reverse. Someone who can't hear, who doesn't realize their computer audio is on, now just disturbed all their coworkers that sit near them. So it goes both ways. All right. So Next section is cognitive. This could be an array of different issues that we need to accommodate. Some things are like Down syndrome or autism, but also dementia or people who have a hard time keeping things in memory. What we really want to do here is minimize distractions and make really simple and consistent user interfaces. But do you know who else benefits from that? People who are sitting in their office constantly distracted by their phone and email and people walking in and their kids calling and their dog barking if you're in my house. All of that is happening. So if we make things very clear and consistent, it helps everybody. So to do that, we want to use easy to read typeface. Um, we want to make sure our navigation elements are consistent, meaning if you have a slicer bank and you always put it on the left of the page and it's pretty consistent across pages, use the same fonts and the same colors and the same formatting options in your slicers so that when people look at the page, that's not a new thing they have to learn on every page. They know, oh, I got this down from page 1 and it's the same on page 2 and 3. We also want to minimize movement that doesn't convey any information. There's some really good custom visuals out there. One is like for a network graph, and I actually use it to document my Power BI and tabular models, but it has an option where the nodes in the network graph bounce around. Now imagine trying to just understand the graph, but things move around on you.
Megan, are you still there? Oh,
Can you hear me?
we can. Yes, you were silent for a second. We were concerned, but you're back.
Can you see my screen still?
I can.
Okay, good, because I can't see it on YouTube again yet. There we go. Okay, so we want to minimize movement. This includes, and I use it all the time, the play axis. The play axis is not inherently bad. The play axis with autoplay, where it rotates through values on a set time frame, like let's change this value every 3 seconds. That's what's really hard for people. Let's say you have a hard time reading because you are dyslexic, and we're cycling through values. And I actually did this in that report we just looked at. There we go. It's cycling through random facts. That's nice, but if you have a hard time taking that information in, that gets really stressful. We want, we want to give people time to read it in their own, however long it takes them. Let's say this is actually a really important work report that has a disco ball at the top. We are sitting here trying to read those facts and they just keep changing. And you're super stressed out because you didn't get the information. This could also just be someone who speaks English as a second language and we're using some technical jargon in there and we're making it really hard for them. And it doesn't need to be that stressful. Your reports should not stress people out. We want Power BI reports to enlighten people and make people happy. So along with that, I already mentioned, we want to try to reduce language and jargon and acronyms where it's not obvious what it means. That's not saying don't ever use them, but consider your audience. If they'll know what it means, then you're good. But if they probably won't, or it's not something you talk about every day, can you write it out or can you put it in a tooltip or another report that explains what's going on? And then just be aware, data viz in general, make sure your graphs are not overly complicated just for the sake of showing off what buttons you can click in Power BI. That's not the goal of our data viz. In this case, when we're sharing with other people, we're trying to explain information and not just show off what we can make. So I'll show you my bad example of excessive cognitive load here. I run SQL Saturday Denver, which is a free one-day event that people talk about SQL Server and Power BI. And people tend to like Denver, so we get people from all over the US and sometimes the world to come and speak. So before the event last year, I made this report that I thought was a lot of fun to say, hey, look at all the great speakers and topics that I have. But if you notice, I'm using the play axis. So it's what's making the pictures and the text cycle through. But again, think of someone who needs a little more time to read for whatever reason. Maybe they'll see that I kind of hit a play axis in the bottom and that they can stop it or pause it and cycle through themselves, but it's really not obvious. You just have to know that that thing is a play axis. So, what if instead I still kept the same, whatever fun fonts and background and same idea, but I moved my play axis up to make it really obvious, added a little note, and said, here's how this works. Click play. And now I can use these buttons to pause. If we need to take a moment to read that Angela is presenting on SSIS, we can do that. If I know that I need more time than what's set, I can just hit next and keep reading rather than trying to beat the time limit, the buzzer on this, just to get the information. All right, third category, motor. So this could be people with repetitive strain injuries if you've been sitting at your keyboard for 30 years and now you've got wrist issues. People with Parkinson's, muscular dystrophy. The main thing that you want to remember for this is that these users may not use a mouse. So I showed you keyboard shortcuts earlier, and that's part of it, but there's more to it than that. If some people may be able to use a mouse, but if you've ever built a Power BI report and you dragged a new visual onto the page and for some reason it got lost behind some other ones and you had to go change the Z order, or you're trying to resize by drag and drop and you're trying to get it pixel perfect, which there are better ways to do that, but
Oh, your audio cut out again. Oh no. Meagan, are you there?
I'm trying to be.
Okay, and you're back. You just cut out for a second.
Okay, good. Sorry, I usually have perfect internet connection, but today of all days is, of course, when it's something's going wrong. Okay, so motor accessibility, one is keyboard accessibility, but we may also just have elements that are too close together. If people need to hover over something to get a tooltip, because we have those nice tooltip reports now, or if we just have things that they need to click and the places they need to click are really small. I have this problem sometimes when I'm clicking on stuff. When I do Power BI trainings, I'm on a projector and looking at a tiny laptop screen, and it's not the same as my 3 monitors at home, and I'm trying to click this thing and it's tiny. Well, we don't want to, again, stress people out and make everybody's life hard when they need to use our Power BI reports. So if somebody needs to click on something, just make sure that things are spaced out enough so that it's easy to click. And then just be aware again of custom visuals that have moving elements. Moving elements are tricky to catch if you actually need to hover over them and see what one is. And it's just a frustrating experience. So I'll show you what it's like to look at a keyboard unfriendly report. We're going to do this. So this is a report that uses the same projected employment data, and it's about the change in employment by occupation from 2016 to 2026. I've got a random fun image on the top left, and I'll say this is intentionally built maybe with not best practices because I'm trying to I was trying to imitate a lot of reports I've seen out in the wild while I did testing with a screen reader with an accessibility specialist. So I've got some slicers on the left where I can choose, what's the level of education needed for the job, how much on-the-job training is there, and how much work experience is needed in a related occupation to get in there. So let's say you have a bachelor's degree and you want to see what the fastest growing jobs are over the next 10 years or so. Turns out it's software developers. So I can then click the bar for software developers and see a median annual wage, as well as some specific titles related to that job group. That's great, but there's a problem. Right now, keyboard accessibility lets you select visuals. You can tab through them, but you can't actually select anything inside a visual. So if I do my fancy show data thing here, I can't click on an item in a slicer right now. There will be updates to this. I know accessibility is a priority for Microsoft, but right now, as you build reports, keep in mind that keyboard-only users can't actually select a value here. They can't select this bar to be able to get the information out of the word cloud or see a meaningful median annual wage. So this word cloud is basically useless without selecting something. So I took that information and I rewrote it into the report that we saw earlier. So I thought, what's the important information I want people to get out of it? Let's make that explicitly on the page. So now what I probably want to know out of this data, what are the highest growth occupations and what are the lowest growth occupations? So if you're looking for a new career, maybe check out solar photovoltaic installers. But if you secretly wanted to be a locomotive firer, I got some bad news for you. I still get, some interactivity. I can filter these by, what amount of training I may need, which ones fall in which categories. And then on the right, I can see the top paying occupations by level of education. So then I can see, what? I happen to have a master's degree. I did my MBA a few years ago. So the top paying occupation for people with a master's degree are nurse anesthetists, political scientists, and computer information research scientists. And then I can see the change in employment over time because it's all right there. I don't have to go digging for it. Well, this is kind of an accessibility thing. This really is a data viz in general thing. If it's an important point, we want to make it really obvious on the page. That's not to say don't use interactivity, don't use tooltips, all of that. But if it's the most important thing we think our users should get out of the report, we probably want to make it really obvious. That takes us to our last category. So to be visually accessible, we want to accommodate color vision deficiency, low vision, and in some cases, complete blindness. The things that we have at our disposal that are the most important are actually just general design attributes: size, contrast, color. Those are things we should be using wisely anyway, but they're also the things we use to be accessible. So here's a list of Power BI features we want to consider when we're trying to design to be more accessible. Most of these aren't accessibility specific. Chart titles. Chart titles are good for everybody. If you make a really obvious chart title, people know what's in the chart. So if I have low vision, I can read the chart title and then decide how much effort I want to spend examining the chart. In focus mode, as well as the spotlight, can help me zoom in on something and just concentrate on that. You can put, in some cases it's helpful, markers on your line and area charts to make it easier for someone with low vision to hover over a specific point, to see a specific point in line with a specific year or month, something like that. And then we already saw the accessible show data table and the keyboard shortcuts. Report themes also come in handy here because once you figure out what colors are colorblind friendly and have good contrast, you can just reuse them in your reports as much as it makes sense. So we don't have to keep coming up with new things when we're really talking about the same subject, and we don't want to have to spend, if it's me, hours picking out your colors one more time. There's also alt text available. Just like in websites for people that use screen readers, we can add alt text to every visual on our Power BI report page. So in general, when we're approaching visual accessibility, as we saw on the WCAG standard earlier, we don't rely on color as the only indicator. We want to populate alt text for all non-decorative visuals. If you have an image on there that doesn't convey real information, it's more an engagement experience thing, you don't have to put the alt text. Or you have a shape. Screen readers announce everything on the page. There's not a way right now to say don't announce it. So it'll say shape. So be aware, at least populate alt text for the things that are meaningful. Again, we want to avoid auto playing video or audio because it may take them a while to find where the buttons are to click to turn it off or pause it. Or if they're keyboard only, they actually can't. That custom visual I was using to play the audio, it's not keyboard accessible because the visuals, the actual interaction with the visual isn't there yet. Again, that'll change over time, and I'm excited to see it. Also, don't settle for 8 or 9 point text size if you can. Make it bigger. The WCAG standard recommends something like 18 or 14 bold. That's probably going to be really hard to do in a Power BI report, but see if you can make it bigger so that people have an easier time reading it. Because even when we go into in focus mode, the font size doesn't increase right now, just the bars. So increase your font size to whatever is feasible and still looks good.
I've got good news for you on that. Looking at the latest telemetry, most people on the planet are turning on data labels and turning them to 12. So they're making those two changes. I don't know if it's certain for accessibility, but people realize it does help. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. It's good to know. Thanks for everybody that does that. Whether you intended to or not, we're making your reports more accessible. When you're choosing a font, the general guidance is sans serif fonts are easier to read. What you want to pay attention to is wider stroke fonts, not meaning the actual letter is wide, but the lines used to make the letter are sufficiently wide. And then we want to pay attention to the contrast between foreground and background. That could be our text, but it could be bars or other things within our visual. So we're going to go back and look at our report one more time and check out the alt text. So we already explained, I redid this to be very explicit and limit the amount of interaction that's used, which I would 100% say that's a highlight of Power BI. I'm not saying don't ever use interaction, but make sure the things that you want to communicate are super obvious and then add more interaction on top of that. So if I click on this first chart, under General, there is an alt text box for me to type in. So it gives you 250 characters. And when a screen reader reads this, it's really cool. It'll read the title of the chart and then the type of chart. So clustered bar chart, something like that. Then it will read your alt text. So when because we can see everything on the page, talk about a report, we go, oh yeah, that bar chart on the top left, that someone who can't see it or can't see very well gets that from a screen reader. They know it's also a clustered bar chart, even though they may not see it that way. So because this was static, actually just put in the statistics. But the more information you can give someone that uses a screen reader to help them know whether to really look into it and dig in, do I go to the show data page and start reading all the actual data points, or do I skip to the next visual? That's really what we want to do here. So I put an accessibility checklist on my blog last night that you can go and grab that covers most of what we talked about today, but puts in a really concise format. The URL's at the top of this screen.
Meagan, were you going to summarize with that? Because if so, maybe we could take some questions and then have you summarize after the questions.
I got one or two more things to show,
Okay,
and then
no,
we
no,
can
no problem.
definitely take
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, okay, good. Sounds perfect.
So in my accessibility checklist, I run through most of what we talked about today. So here's my color contrast, but it lists it out by the type of visual or the type of feature in Power BI. So here's the things you should check for all visuals versus slicers, what to do in a text box, set your sort order, all of that. And then I list out the accessibility features that are available in Power BI, as well as tools you can use to check your accessibility. And that is our last set of demos. So we already saw keyboard navigation. When you're building Power BI reports for mobile devices, the easiest thing to do is to look at your report or dashboard with your brightness on low. So you won't be able to read everything, and that's not the goal. But it's, do the important things stand out so I know where to navigate to get the information I want. And then if you want to check color vision deficiency, I tend to use Coblis, but there's VizCheck and a whole lot of other things and add-ins for browsers. But what I do is I just take a screenshot of my report, and I happen to have a report on my desktop. This is a report for someone who's managing their blood glucose, and it uses a mostly blue and purple and gray color palette. But we got our glucometer and tomatoes up here. Oop. And we can use this to test the different types of color blindness. So when I go to Red Week, not much changes because of my blue color palette. Blue is one of my favorite colors, so I tend to use it, but also it's pretty colorblind friendly. So I'm kind of just being lazy. When we go to red blind, our tomatoes turned into tomatillos, but it's okay because all of our information that is conveyed in the charts is actually looking pretty good still. So I check red and green weak and red and green blind because those are the most common. Like I said, we can't do every single type. We can't accommodate everybody, um, but we can try to accommodate the most common scenarios. So that is our color blindness checker. And then we can check for color contrast, which I mentioned earlier. I like to use accessible colors, but there's definitely alternatives out there. So if you go to accessible-colors.com, you can grab your text color and your background color and see if you meet the standard. So I'm going to do that really quickly. Let's check and see if that dark font on the purple background has enough contrast. So I'm going to go to my conditional formatting and pull out that purple color and put that as my background. And then my font color is actually black. You could go pull that out of Power BI as well. That's not necessary. I think it's 9 point in that one because it was kind of small. Is that right? No, that's white. I need black. That's all zeros. Let me make sure. Oops. Of course, I left that open. So grab our text color, which is all zeros because it's black, and put that in there. And now I'm past the standard for a required 4.5 contrast. I'm 6.93. But let's go back and let's say I was using white text. That doesn't work. What accessible colors will do is say, okay, let's say you want to leave your text the same color, but if you just adjust your background just a little bit, here's a new color for you. Use this instead, and you'll be just fine. Or if you want to change your text color and leave your background, here's what you should use. So you don't even have to waste the effort to find a new color. It's suggesting them for you just by doing different modifications to your original color. The experience your users get from this purple versus this purple is probably not very different, but it's a really easy thing for you to do to be more accessible. Oh, and then blur tool. So I have a Chrome add-in that I use for this called the squint test. And it allows me to blur things a whole lot or just a little. But if we go to about 3, I can't quite read the text, but I do get to see what stands out most in the page. So this is a check of visual layout. Do we guide the reader through the way that they're supposed to go? Do the important things stand out so that if it's actually difficult, it takes a lot of effort for me to read my report, do I get guided to the right things first?
Megan, I was chatting with Alan Jones and Brendan. How did you do the squint test again? I love that, by the way.
It's a Chrome add-in.
Okay, got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It's actually called Squint Test.
Perfect.
So yeah, we use that in data viz and in web page design just to check, what stands out the most, but it's also nice for accessibility.
I told you how I do mine, right? I take my laptop and move it back 30 feet from the people I'm actually testing. I like yours a lot better.
So I think I only have 2 slides left. Let me get through those and then we'll just do questions at the end.
Okay.
So, one more demo that I totally forgot about. One thing I did to make this report more accessible, and you definitely don't have to do this, but sometimes it's not obvious that we have all these great accessibility features in Power BI. Like if you didn't know that the high contrast stuff just came out, that might be, you'd miss it. Or if you didn't know those keyboard shortcuts because you never thought to hit question mark, I added a little bookmark to this report because sometimes I make reports for people who aren't frequent users of Power BI. So while some of you may go look up, docs or may go to a training, other people who are just consumers may not. So I added a bookmark that when I click it, takes me to a page that just explains the features. So if somebody is struggling to read the report, but they happen to notice that button, then they can check out and see all of these. I'm not saying do this on every report, but I'm hoping that this will give you ideas to help people who may not actually get formal training to understand these features, but may really need to take advantage of them. All right, now last couple slides. So we talked about all these visual elements for visual and cognitive accessibility, and I've been saying this throughout the whole webinar. These map to usability in general. These aren't this extra thing you have to do. Most of the time, they improve general usability. So size and contrast and element movement have to do with pre-attentive attributes. We do this in data viz anyway. These are the things we notice without making conscious effort to notice them. You notice that one bar is longer than another in a chart without you going, there are bars. This bar is longer than this bar. Your brain just does that. It's good at it. Affordances are making it really obvious how to use something. That's where the alt text and your chart titles come in, your consistent navigation elements with maybe your slicer bank or the way you place your titles and all that, so that people get it. They learn it once and then they get to keep going and not have to relearn it every time they look at a new report or report page. And then cognitive load is about how our design can enhance or distract from our message. So if we have legible fonts that are, easy to read, and we avoid lots of complex jargon and acronyms where we have to go off to the side and look things up, or our graphs are just overly complicated or overly decorated, that helps with accessibility, but that's usability too, because we're all busy, we're all distracted. We all just want to get in there, read, get the information out of the report, and have a good experience. So accessibility is usability. And accessibility can make business sense. It's expensive to maintain 2 versions because you have to pay someone to do it. You have to republish things depending on how you're making things available. But it can be more expensive to retrofit. Let's say you start doing work with a government agency, or you hire a new coworker who can't see colors and you used all colors as indicators. Do you really want to do, if you're in a big company, a 6-month project to go back and make everything accessible when you could have just added icons, maybe some alt text, things like that as you were building? That's kind of a big deal. And since we saw that accessibility is usability, it enhances usability, that usability can increase adoption, which could lead to higher, coworker customer satisfaction. And depending on how you're using Power BI, increased revenue long term. So, what I'm hoping you'll get out of this is that while accessibility is a little bit complicated, there are a lot of really easy changes we can make. So, what if you just started building your Power BI reports with inclusiveness in mind? You checked your color contrast, made sure things were colorblind friendly, made sure your points that you're trying to make with your data were obvious on the page, things that don't take extra hours of effort at all. And then someone started working with you, or someone became your customer, and they were just able to do their job. And this was a report, something they could use instead of something they had to overcome. All right, that's what I got. And I think we have about 9 minutes for questions.
We do. We have a couple minutes. So I'm going to ask the first one, mine, because I've got the microphone and I get to ask the first question, and it comes from Chuck. You didn't show the dashboard themes and its high contrast, uh, especially from the blog post we've been teasing. Is that because it's not great, or is it just because it wasn't for front of mind when you actually did the session for us?
Uh, it just really wasn't front of mind. I
Okay.
tend to not use dashboards a lot and
Yeah. Yeah.
focus more on reports. And so I wanted to make sure I showed reports more than dashboards, but I haven't seen anything wrong with it.
Okay, perfect. So the fact that it has one built in is kind of nice, because if there were, when you went to go out to your report and say select theme, it would be nice to have themes that had things like 12 point plus fonts, labels turned on, high contrast palettes. Not taking away from what Amanda's done and what you showed, but it'd be also nice to have a couple static themes that changed more than just those colors. And that was a comment made by a couple people and me. So would you say that that's actually a good solution, or does that make sense what I'm suggesting?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay. Uh, skeuomorphism. I don't want to lead the witness. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you know what that is? I had to look it up, by the way.
As it relates to Power BI reports,
Yes.
was there a specific question there?
Yeah. So I actually, we landed, me and the person who was at Brandon, I think it was Brandon, landed on the exact opposite sides, and I didn't know that when he first asked about it. So skeuomorphism, for the people on the call or on the webinar, is where you go out and you use real world representations or images to portray your data. So I could give examples, but again, I think my examples are going to lead the witness a little bit, and I don't want to do that.
So are we saying like an infographic type visual where we're using, let's say we're doing car sales or something and we have like little cars in our chart? Or
Exactly right. Or if you're actually talking about phones and you have a picture of a phone with different features that are getting used, maybe you actually go out and say this feature is usually getting used 30%. Or Devon Energy does an amazing job where they draw their oil rigs, and you can go out and actually have slicers on it. This Synoptic panel does an amazing job of tearing apart what was an airplane engine. You can click on
yeah.
pieces of the airplane engine to create slicers. So again, I just threw in adjectives I didn't mean to, and I've already colored the audience. So what are your
Well, so
thoughts
I
on?
think that if it increases engagement, it's fine. But if it's really just a shiny clicky thing, then you probably want to reevaluate. I read a study once, and I don't know how sound it was, but I think it was from Robert Cosara, who's affiliated with Tableau. At least that's where I got the link, where they checked that. They basically said if we do, and I forget the name of the charts where they basically use little icons instead of the bars, and that it didn't decrease ability of perception of the numbers.
Gotcha, gotcha. So you could
Brandon
make
says
sure.
that's not skeuomorphism. He
Oh,
says it's an image behind a chart. It takes up space and doesn't tell a story.
so the definition of skeuomorphism, I did have to look it up, is where you go out and use images to portray the data. So I would agree with you that, and me and Megan actually were really trying to help somebody who's doing this horrifically wrong and didn't get the fact that she was doing it horrifically wrong. You can do great damage with your images behind your data. Um,
Yes.
and there's easy ways of flattening that out to not detract. Um, but I think the definition of skeuomorphism where you're actually using the image to portray your data. So Amanda, who's on the call, thank you, Amanda, just went out and says that there are positively themes in the gallery that does accessibility with all those different settings like I was talking about. It's just not in the product, yet. So I'm hoping Amanda is our program manager on top of these features, and the yet is actually alludes to great things to come, I'm hoping. Okay, so I will look back over the questions, but I would notice that you said that we could not get into the word cloud through the readers and accessibility. How how do you solve that, and would you recommend solving it knowing a little bit of what Amanda's roadmap is? Because you could solve that by putting a bookmark next to it, toggle that visual out for a table or something that is reader accessible. What would
Yep.
be your recommendation for that?
So it turns out bookmarks, you can't click them
Oh
with a
no.
keyboard.
Oh no.
So there's a little bit of a struggle there, but you could switch that. Mostly what I do is check it for keyboard accessibility if I know that's a need and I'm that word cloud if that was super important. Um, I do just change the visual to something that works. When you use custom visuals in general, you could try just let them have that show data that's screen reader accessible or just go to show data. Sometimes custom visuals, if they're older, don't work with that. They don't produce good data. So I just try to find the custom visuals that work well for that if I feel that that one is definitely needed.
Got it. Okay. So Scott's going out to do a shout out for Amanda's What's New. Great. Scott will say, when will customer visual developer be able to tie into the theme colors? Actually, I thought we released that this month. I think it just released, actually, Scott. And if it didn't, actually, I think it was 2 months ago. So, oh, and then Amanda says we have a bug for bookmarks being uh, not being clickable. So it's a bug. It's actually not a deficiency. So we know it's actually something that we should have, and it's on the team's backlog. So that is amazing. So
Yeah.
Meagan, I want to hand it over to you, and I want to thank you profusely for helping me at the California User Group, Indiana, for both the admin and the design sessions, and let you finish and let you summarize it once again.
Thanks. So I just hope everybody can take away that really simple changes can make things more accessible. We may not get 100% there, but it's better to try to get 50% there or even 20% there than do nothing. And then you can check out the accessibility checklist on my blog, which is datasavvy.me. And so it's out there for you to use. And I hope that you'll show everybody what kind of accessible reports you make from here on out.
Thank you very much, Meagan. Thank you very much, everybody, and Amanda as well. Thanks, guys.